Thank you. I want to thank Yusuf for suggesting this panel. It was his idea, which began as an information session because we felt that there might have been a lot of people here who didn't know very much about Sudan. It's become, of course, much more urgent since the horrific massacres of the 3rd of June. I want to thank my fellow panelists for their willingness to share their expertise, Khaled Ahmed, and especially Nisreen Alamin and Khaled Medani, who traveled long distances to be with us today. Am I okay for sound? Yes. Great. I also want to thank my staff, who aren't here today, but who and my graduate students in the Department of Anthropology for their assistance in putting on this event, arranging the venue, providing coffee and tea, and to Professor Mariam Lo, who is the Director of African Studies at U of T, for providing lovely food. And thanks to all of you who came today to participate with us on a Saturday afternoon where I understand the traffic conditions are not ideal. My address is basically going to outline some of the challenges I think that people who are from the lower or lower middle classes face on the ground, and also maybe talk about why so many women seem to be involved in the protest. It may not come as a surprise to any of us in the room, but I think it was a surprise for the Western media. So I'm a social anthropologist who first went to Sudan as a naive graduate student in 1976. I was welcomed as a trainee into the small Jali village I worked in on the Nile north of Kabushia. I lived there initially for 15 months, being guided by village women and learning everything I could about their lives. My early research focused on ZAR and the way it enabled women to speak back to various sets of powers, colonizers, government officials, presumptuous foreigners like myself, but also to husbands, fathers, mothers-in-law, and other kin, speaking to them through the spirits that had taken hold of them, and doing so in subtle, critical, and often hilarious ways. I spent another 6 months in the village between 1983 and 84, returned for a shorter visit in 94, but then stayed away for some of the more difficult years of the Bashir regime. Even if I had been able to go back and visit my friends, I think my presence would have endangered their lives. But since 2008 until this year, I've been returning annually for visits of a month and sometimes, if I'm lucky, 2. And I was just there for last February 2018. My current research focuses on the same families I began doing research with some 43 years ago, exploring how their lives have changed, and many of these families have dispersed. They've left the village, but return there periodically, in fact several times a year, often for Eid, certainly for weddings and other celebrations, and to visit ailing kin. The traffic goes back and forth, and it's quite a highway. Most of those who left now live in suburbs surrounding Khartoum and Omdurman, in Selma, Saura, Haj Yusuf, Naim. Together with the women of these families, I'm exploring how the short-lived oil boom and new information technologies stimulated changes in their social lives, kindled the aspirations of youth, and reshaped everyone's expectations of what a normal life should entail. The smart, creative, educated, and resourceful youth of these families are deeply frustrated by existing obstacles to their social, economic, and civic participation, a few of which I will sketch today. The economic status of these families can be described as lower middle to middle class, mostly on the lower end. Until recently, however, they were utterly mobile, whereas the older women are non- or semi-literate. Some of their daughters and the majority of their granddaughters have college or university educations. And while not the poorest people in Sudan, most lead lives of considerable precarity, a word that has become common today in describing life in Africa and especially in conflict zones. Several of these families' daughters and sons, born between the 1970s and the 1990s, also find themselves in a kind of limbo, chronologically adult, but still regarded as youth because they have not yet married. The reasons for this are multiple and complex, but the main problem is economic. They can't afford to get married, or not in a socially acceptable way. They can't afford a nikah marriage, for instance. Many of you here today will undoubtedly recognize this problem. These not-so-young women and men are caught in between, in what Diane Singerman, writing about a similar trend in Egypt, refers to as waithood, as opposed to adulthood. For decades, the families I work with, along with other Sudanese, have placed a high value on educating girls. My friends say that educated women raise smart and resourceful children. The concern for keeping girls in school declined during the first years of Islamist control, but revived after 2005, when the regime relaxed its enforcement of women's deportment rules. There are more universities and colleges in Sudan than ever before, numbering over 60, I was told recently, created as part of Bashir's civilizing project. And women are attending these universities in droves. I'm not going to suggest that the institutions are all first-rate or that significant barriers to female education have disappeared. Especially in poorer families, a daughter's education may be sacrificed for a son's if resources are tight. Economic sanctions and structural adjustment programs have led to steep reductions in government funding for education, despite the growing number of universities, and an inevitable decline in quality. Few of the families I visit trust their young children to the impoverished public education system. Thus, the number of private elementary schools in the country has grown. Their quality varies, but they are costly all the same. No matter the system, the fees for books, uniforms, school breakfasts, and incidentals that must be privately borne are prohibitive to many. That said, the fleeting oil prosperity of the last decade produced skewed attendance of the genders at universities and colleges. According to UN and Sudan government figures, female enrollment in post-secondary education now greatly exceeds that of males. With increased access to university places and a growing economy until 2012, it was the rare family from the village that did not have a daughter in college or recently graduated, even among the working class. Here, the ubiquitous cell phone has been a contributing factor. With it, relatives feel they can monitor a young woman and ensure she is safe even when attending a public coeducational institution, such as the University of Khartoum. Moreover, so few men now enroll in university that coeducation has become almost moot. Students I spoke to at the University of Khartoum estimated that 75% of their classmates are women. Indeed, female domination of post-secondary education is a familiar topic, especially among the Habubat, among the older women. By educating themselves, they say, girls are finding it harder to find husbands. The young women disagree. Most want to work before marriage and are keen to put their educations to use. As for young men, I was told that fewer of them continue to read after high school because they need to make money to contribute to household expenses. Most of them live with their parents or extended kin. There is what academics call a high dependency ratio in Sudan, with 4 persons of dependent age, under 15 or over 65, for every person of working age between the ages of 15 and 64. Most young men hustle to make money however they can. They do so to help fund their sisters' educations in addition to supplying money for the family, and accumulate savings toward their own future marriages. It can take years of work and family savings to afford a wedding. Many of you must know. Several young men in these families drive amjads or rickshaws, that's unofficial taxis, or belong to a musical ensemble that entertains at weddings. And as you probably know, wedding businesses are numerous and lucrative in Sudan. Some young men work at several informal jobs in order to make ends meet. Thus, more of my friends' daughters than sons have college educations, but few of either are stably employed. Many remain with their natal families well into their 30s, studying, working here and there, or guiding bus, just sitting, or participating in the great economy, distributing goods and services such as cell phone minutes, which is a fun thing to talk about, via their social networks. Unmarried women typically live with their parents or, if they are deceased, with other responsible kin. Not to do so would court disgrace. Sons, married or not, typically live with their parents as well, unless that is, as is common, they go abroad for work. In Sudan's last census, completed in 2008, women outnumber men in every population cohort 20 years of age and over, an artifact of high rates of male labor migration. The government's own, this is a very interesting term, nuptiality figures of those who are married. The government's own nuptiality figures attest to the difficulties of getting married. 30% of men between the ages of 20 and 54 have never been wed. The percentage of unmarried women in this age group is lower, but still pretty high, at 15%, and reflects in part the rising practice of polygyny as disparities in wealth increase in this century's neoliberal context. Highly successful men can marry more than one wife, others can't marry at all. Still, economic, social, and cultural factors do not tell the whole story here. Demography is also at play. Countries of the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region, are undergoing a demographic transition owing to declining mortality rates, rising lifespans, improvements to child and maternal health, and an attendant late conclusion to childbearing. These changes in the MENA region have produced a new age structure and a youth bulge where 60% of the population is below the age of 25. The figure for Sudan is even higher. It's more than 63% of the population that is under the age of 25. This suggests that more and more young people will be competing for ever scarcer resources, and some of which will enable them to formally wed, have children of their own, and start fully adult lives. More are going abroad if they can. More of those who stay are seeking and getting educations in this age of global connectivity, and here women are leading the way. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Sudanese women have long been community leaders, together with men, as well as pillars of their families. There is a lengthy history and tradition of female leadership in the region, going back to the queens and queen mothers of Cushan and Nubia, through to the position of the Haboba, the grandmother, in contemporary Sudan, to say nothing of the strong Sudanese feminist movement from the post-colonial period until today. I want to point out that Nisreen has co-authored an op-ed on this point for Al Jazeera, and we can post the link. All of this flies in the face of popular media representations of Sudanese women, and even those of well-meaning international NGOs. They seem unwilling to recognize that women and men may have complementary leadership roles. But no one who knows Sudan was surprised by the actions of the brave young woman, Ala Saleh, who became the media icon of the revolution and whose image is captured in the poster for our event. I mentioned precarity and neoliberalism earlier in this talk. Sudan's economy began to boom with the development of oil and gas reserves and ensuing exports of crude in 1999. By 2003, neoliberalization was in full sway. Negotiations with the International Monetary Fund had produced a reformed banking system, restructured taxes and tariffs, and, importantly but regressively, privatized social services, including healthcare. Between the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005 until South Sudan's independence in July 2011, the economy soared. GDP grew at over 8% per year. With the global monetary crisis of 2008, expansion waned, yet did not immediately stall. But in 2012, secession of South Sudan and the attendant loss of petro revenue spun the North's economy into steep decline. In 2017, the US lifted some of its sanctions, but this, I understand, was not the boom it was expected to be. Despite a slumping economy, inflation has surged. Friends say that the cost of necessary foodstuffs, such as flour, sugar, and cooking oil, have risen faster than those of other items, at least by 40 to 50% per year, and now even more. Price controls are illusory or non-existent, and wages have not risen to keep pace for the working class. As noted earlier, well over a third of the labor force is jobless, and over half of these are youth between the ages of 15 and 24. Those who work are often underemployed. Although inflation rates began to decline in 2015 with government attempts to increase agricultural production, albeit in questionable ways, as we may talk about a bit later, inflation has risen sharply since 2018 and stood at 73% in December as the protests began. The currency has been sharply devalued. Ironically, throughout the regime, US dollars have been the currency of choice. I say ironic because, of course, the sanctions were US-led. And US cash is particularly valued. Any savings that families have in Sudanese pounds, such as savings for healthcare, education, the weddings of sons, routinely evaporate as quickly as they are set aside. In light of all this, and I'm just concluding, it seems to me entirely understandable that a group of schoolgirls in Accra, protesting the government's tripling of the cost of their school breakfasts, were the match that lit the fires of the ongoing revolution.